now. Former Brazilian President Lula da Silva is making a political comeback since his 2019 release from prison. He only served about 580 days after Brazil's Supreme Court annulled the corruption charges against him and restored his political rights, if you like. As Brazil's president between 2003 and 2010, he presided over an extraordinary period of economic growth. Tens of millions of poor Brazilians were lifted out of poverty, and GDP growth topped 7.5% at some stage. In South Africa, the SACP and Cosatu have been impressed by his economic achievements and spoke about us having our Lula moment. Today, the country's economy is overburdened with recovery not only from the pandemic but from years of state capture. So we want to ask, what happened to our Lula moment? Let's try and unpack this question. Bring in Economist at Nascence Advisory Services, Xhanti Payi, who joins us now via our video link. Xhanti, great to see you. Welcome again to the program. I want us to, before we unpack what the Lula moment is, speak about Lula da Silva. He and former President Jacob Zuma couldn't have had, if you like, a more similar trajectory in terms of their public life. Who is this man? And when did he start having resonance with our socio-economic discourse?
Look, I mean, I think President Lula really was a very popular leader. And certainly, I think one of the key things in Brazil, and I think one of the key things there was that really actually that is the thing that propelled him into government and into power. And I think he's one of those people called the populist leaders. And certainly, for a time, he had great success in terms of economic outcomes for the people of Brazil. And now, actually, then found himself in a very difficult situation where he also ended up in jail for corruption. Where he was actually led for corruption in terms of, I think, some benefits, in terms of personal benefits that he received, and ended up in jail where he spent some serious time, I think much more than what our former president is likely to spend. And then actually he's having a second bite at the chair, as you were saying in your introduction. But certainly, President Lula was a very popular Brazilian leader in the early 2000s.
He got some things right? I think many people will agree with that. And what are some of those things that he was able to, I guess, introduce to the Brazilian nation that worked?
Look, I think one of the key things that he led with right from the beginning was this idea that he wanted to defeat hunger. So he wanted to make sure, and in his first speech, he talks very clearly about this idea that, there can't be certain people who have 3 to 5 meals a day while others have one or none. He drew a very direct hunger. And so I think, because I think there's a big difference, of course, between a hunger drive and a poverty drive. But then a lot of the poor people started actually making sure that there was hunger. And then he drove a really big social program that would actually lead the decrease of poverty in Brazil. So, and that social program is one of the big things that a lot of South Africans have spoken about. It's one of the things that South Africans are talking about, how we actually deliver, so social security, making sure that having the public works programs that actually put people into employment. And I think the Lula moment is defined really by a big drive against him. And I think for a while that was very successful. Yeah. But unfortunately in South Africa, President Zuma, while he was also to certainly be man of the people, very popular when he came in. He was very much, obviously, the stark contrast as people thought of President Thabo Mbeki, who, President Thabo Mbeki, under his time, people said, he is a president who runs surpluses instead of deficits, so that actually the budget balanced. We should spend more and more on poverty programs. We should have more social security, that is, increase the grants, make sure that there's a general grant, all of these kinds of things. But I must say that, of course, it's important to note that, the Brazil or the Lula moment was not without its problems, because it led to rising inflation after a while. And then, of course, it was not particularly sustainable because we have actually balanced the books.
That's exactly where I was hoping to go. I find it ironic that it's called a Lula moment. It's telling us that it's a situation that came to pass, when in fact we'd want to be speaking about something a whole lot more sustainable, something that's actually able to outlive any particular individual.
No, absolutely, and I think that's a very big part of it. And I think one of the key things we want to do, I guess, in the hopefully one had been hoping that once we get past, I guess, the big fanfare, because I think at the beginning all politicians, of course, want to create a big impact, is how you actually make sure that you stabilize the economies and make sure that every gain that you put in is sustainable. And that requires a little bit more than social programs, because social programs actually keep about where people are rather than where people should be, where people are aspiring to be. And that requires really issues of education, distribution, proper wealth, to make sure that wealth is well distributed, not taken from one to the other, but actually there's structures that allow people to succeed. There is also infrastructure that allows people to actually get, for gains. So you want housing programs that work for people in a manner that says, it doesn't keep you in a house here, but it makes sure that you can actually move around and be mobile in countries where, of course, we have a lot of people wanting to travel to actually gain opportunities. We have, infrastructure programs that allow people to be able to have energy sources and water resources for farming and for, energy for running their businesses. So these are very key things that you want. And I think sometimes, that is lost. Let's give people what they need today and see, and we'll see about tomorrow. And I think one of the key things we have to do in this country is certainly to put people on a trajectory to reach their aspirations, rather than to hope that because they're hungry today and we've solved that problem, that their hunger problem tomorrow. Because of course, these big social programs require tax money, and taxes only come from a country that has people who are actually working and producing. Otherwise, we are going to run out of those taxes. And I think in many instances, of course, Brazil ran into financial troubles later on, right, because of the productive nature of the economy.
And I guess that's a good time to speak about the lessons learned. So much of the Lula moment, if you like, was also invested in our former president here, Jacob Zuma, which, again, this feels like a Shakespearean script, given how things have landed up for Jacob Zuma. In fact, when Lula was being arrested, he too had his supporters trying to block police from trying to get him to jail. It's almost like, a duplicate situation when you think about what's unfolding in Nkandla.
No, certainly. I mean, of course, I think, the circumstances are quite different, the prosecution and all of that. I think one has to say immediately that in Brazil, they don't have the kind of justice, the criminal justice system that we have, especially not the kind of judiciary that we have in terms of independence and the way it works. But still, it was quite important to draw the parallels. And what people actually hope, I think one of the things democracies and economies get in trouble is because of the way actually the big hopes and promises what actually can be achieved. I think one of the key things that we need is to actually a communication to our general public that speaks a little bit more about the efforts we have to do in the long term in terms of for us to be able to do that. So the government speaking very clearly, it must speak clearly about what it needs to do and what the participation of the citizens has to be. I think in places like, the Lula moments tend to be very much about the person. And we made that mistake with President Zuma, I think, because we thought that, there was a person of Mbeki and then there was a person of Zuma. And therefore, these two personalities make all the difference. The personalities are not the difference. It's usually the people that make the big difference.
What is quite interesting is that it seems we didn't learn that lesson when we were going on about Ramaphosa, isn't
it? No, we didn't learn that lesson at all. I think now we are still in the same moment, whereas actually one of the key things we need is about how does government support people to actually become the economy? How does government support people to actually bring themselves out of poverty and then do so sustainably? And I think one of the key things we have to do is exactly that. I think one of the key things we saw in the Lula moment was really this push, because once you remove the person who has the push, then everything seems to fall apart. But of course, I think one has to say also that under President Zuma, unfortunately, poverty increased, inequality increased. Now, you could count the number of factors that were involved in that time in terms of the global economy, in terms of the South African economy, the politics, but certainly the trajectories are the same. I think their political standing might look similar, but certainly the outcomes in economic terms seem to be vastly apart.
Absolutely. How then do we get to a point where we aren't relying on a messiah? And, people like yourself have warned us against that for quite some time. Don't necessarily pin your hopes on any one individual. But there is something to be said, though, about needing a leader or a kind of leadership to take us to where we need to be.
No, there's no doubt about that. You need good leadership. But the leadership has to actually help actually direct the outcomes towards actually making sure we invest in people. This is the one thing that I think is very, very important. We are still yet to follow, the Constitution, and the people like Nelson Mandela talked very much early on around to actually make sure that we invest in the potential of the people to actually gain for themselves, to actually to actualize their own potential, so that every South African reaches their highest potential. That requires a lot of investment in terms of energy. We are now talking about the future of work in the fourth industrial revolution. How do we make sure we invest in such a way that people can actually recognize this new special moment? And the biggest problem that we have actually is still that we are very much lacking in the infrastructure that we need to be able to do that. So if somebody, for example, wants to own a business, do they have they've given land? Can they plant in that land? Do they have storage? Do they have water resources? Do they have drainage? Do they have transportation? It's true of the mining sector. It's the same thing with, the technology resources. Do we have working internet? In this conversation that you and I have had, if somebody was listening, they've been disrupted over a period of a number of times. And that means we need actually working fast internet to allow people to communicate better with each other. All of these key things are important, because if we just work on sort of social grants, which had been a big part of the Lula Moment, then we will miss the boat, because people will always be where they are rather than where they aspire to be and where they should be on a long-term basis. So we really have to focus very directly on how we unleash the potential of every South African and do so sustainably.
Yeah, it's about having inclusive development that does not necessarily hinge on dependency. Thanks very much indeed for your insights this morning. Xhanti Payi is an economist, also with Nascence Advisory Services. Xhanti, once again, always great chatting to you. Appreciate your time.